The United Nations does not deserve the confidence of this House. But it could. It must. To earn that confidence, the United Nations will have to embrace a real agenda for reform. Thank you, Madam President, for the privilege of addressing this House. Well, I think by now it should be clear that this House should have no confidence in the United Nations. And now, in spite of the framing of the opposition here, this is not a critique of the idea of the United Nations itself, an idea that I served for more than 3 decades as a UN official myself, and an idea that I think remains an essential moral vision for a deeply troubled world. And nor is it a critique of the people who have dedicated their lives to the stated mission of the United Nations, the humanitarian workers, the human rights defenders, the peacemakers, my friends and colleagues, or the more than 150 UNRWA workers slaughtered in Gaza in the last several weeks, many along with their families. These are our heroes, declined, and for them I have no critique, only praise. But this idea and these people have been abandoned by the political leadership of the organization, by its member states and by intergovernmental bodies like the Security Council. And so we have no confidence precisely because we have heard the promise of the United Nations, codified in its own charter, and we have believed it, that the UN would build a world in which aggression would be deterred, development would be advanced, and human rights would be protected under the rule of law. 75 years later, we're still waiting for the fulfillment of that promise. And today, tragically, all evidence points to the inevitable conclusion that if the UN does not change course, and radically so, we will be waiting in vain. Because the Charter did not say that aggression will be deterred unless the US decides to invade Iraq. And it did not say that development would be advanced unless the International Monetary Fund wants to impose austerity and the looting of public assets in developing countries. And it did not say that human rights would be protected unless Israel wants to slaughter Palestinians in Gaza. Now, Ambassador Kariuki quoted for us Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, perhaps the most principled of Secretaries General, who said, as he told us, that the UN was not created to bring us to heaven, but merely to save us from hell. Even against that standard, the organization is still failing. Ask the Tutsi of Rwanda if they were saved from hell when the UN, cowed into silence by Western countries that sought to shirk their legal obligations, ignored the advanced warning of the UN's own special rapporteur on executions, and then withdrew its forces as the murderous campaign began. Ask the Muslims of Bosnia if they were saved from hell when thousands of them were massacred in a declared UN safe zone. Ask the Rohingya of Myanmar if they were saved from hell as the UN in-country tiptoed around the perpetrator government for fear of jeopardizing UN access, and the leadership of the Secretariat in New York continued to push within the Security Council for normalization with a genocidal regime, even as widespread persecution had already become evident. Ask the civilians of Sri Lanka if they were saved from hell when, as the UN's review of its failures in Sri Lanka revealed, that in the face of mass killings, trepidatious senior officials at UN headquarters engaged member states on, quote, what member states wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know to respond effectively. Or ask the people of Syria if they were saved from hell after having endured the bombs dropped on them by 4 out of 5 of the permanent members of the Security Council, and after the distribution of humanitarian aid to the victims was constrained by political considerations by those same states. And today, as we speak here today, we can ask the Palestinians suffering genocide in Gaza if they have been saved from hell by an institution that is incapable of mobilizing protection, of ordering a ceasefire, of condemning the perpetrator, or even of naming the crime out loud. Should these, the abandoned peoples of the United Nations, have confidence in the United Nations? No one would dare say that they should. Didn't have to be this way. The Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the framework of international law, and the righteous demands of the peoples of the United Nations, these do provide a lighted path to a more humane and peaceful world. But in each case that I have described, the road to hell was paved by political compromises, by powerful actors that became moral compromises at the expense of the rights and dignity of the disempowered masses. All because of a presumed wisdom among senior UN leaders that we must not upset the powerful, or even strain long-held diplomatic protocol for so-called sensitive issues. Issues like racial oppression, mass murder, or even planetary destruction. Because time after time, the political leadership of the UN has chosen not to speak truth to power, not to speak law to force, not to remain true to its own charter, mandate to defend peace, human rights, equality, and development, but rather to bow to power, to sacrifice the lives and well-being of millions at the altar of political expediency. Now, the opposition has pointed to the important humanitarian work of the organization, and indeed, millions have benefited from that life-saving and life-changing work. But that work has all too often been in vain, precisely because of the failings and willful moral compromises of the political leadership of the organization. Think of the people of Gaza, twice rendered refugees, imprisoned in an open-air prison, forcibly denied all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights by a ruthless occupying power, and therefore made to be reliant on that humanitarian aid to survive. Well, thank goodness for that humanitarian aid. But what are we to make today of all of the senior-most UN officials fearful of angering the Israeli perpetrator and its complicit US, UK, and Western partners, and on that basis refusing to even condemn the perpetrators who are massacring tens of thousands of civilians, the same beneficiaries of that humanitarian aid? And worse, the recreant refusal to even name the crimes. Apartheid, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and yes, genocide. Is the argument that we should celebrate the feeding of the lamb by those who are silent at its slaughter, or to find peace in the fact that they were first vaccinated? By now, these leaders should have learned from the mathematics of history that humanitarian generosity plus political cowardice can only equal continued impunity, failure, suffering, and death. No, the United Nations does not deserve the confidence of this House. But it could. It must. To earn that confidence, the United Nations will have to embrace a real agenda for reform, to end the undemocratic vestige of northern autocracy that is the P5, to expand the membership of the Security Council and rein in the use of its veto, to further empower the General Assembly as the only universal democratic body, to insulate the Secretariat from direct political control and ring-fence the organization's budgets from pressure by powerful individual states. Declined to align the work of all agencies, including the international financial institutions, with the norms and standards of human rights, labor rights, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. And most importantly, to more fully open UN processes to the free, active, and meaningful participation of civil society groups that are aligned with the purposes and principles of the organization. The international peace movement, the international human rights movement, the international climate movement. And in doing so, to restore the vision of the UN as a norm-based constitutional body dedicated to the cause of peace and development and human rights under the rule of law, rather than a mere conference center, a sieve to filter out the lowest common denominator, or worse, a cynical tool of empire. Clearly, until that day comes, this House should have no confidence in the United Nations. But if you care about the promise of the United Nations and you want to see these changes happen, then you must support the proposition. Thank you.